Welcome to this webinar. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and today I'm joined by the experts Richard Suls and Miguel Gutierrez. And we're going to be talking about the topic of this webinar is from frameworks to proof, lessons learned using the cybersecurity risk information framework to demonstrate regulatory compliance. Let's start with you, Miguel. What exactly is CRI?
Sure, I hope to find some of this alphabet soup. So to start, CRI is the Cyber Risk Institute, and this is the nonprofit standards development organization with the mission of kind of harmonizing all of the different risk management standards that apply across the financial services industry. And so CRI then makes the profile, which is that self-assessment framework that's tailored to the needs of organizations in the financial services sector. And simply put, the CRI profile is going to be a framework that satisfies a room full of regulators. It takes something like a couple thousand, 2,500 overlapping requirements from, I'd say, dozens of different regulations and boils them down to about 300 control objectives. And I think the current version has about 218 different diagnostic statements. It's based off of NIST, the NIST CSF. So the bones of this framework are pretty familiar. You've got govern, identity, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so you can assess your organization against these objectives once, and CRI provides mappings to all of these different relevant regulations or other cybersecurity frameworks. So you do it once, and the bulk of the work you don't have to do again. It's free to download, it's a self-assessment, and it incorporates a tiering system. So it adapts to the size of your organization. So, a multinational is not going to have the same requirements as a small community credit union. So it adapts to that way as well.
Okay, but this is not something like. Is this required by somebody? The CRI, like, am I going to be required to be CRI compliant if I'm in a specific field or?
So specifically, no, this isn't issued by any governing body or regulatory body that says you have to be compliant to CRI.
Yeah.
What's useful about the CRI profile is that many of these questions overlap with, I'll use NYS DFS as an example, overlap with these. And in cases where it doesn't or doesn't completely, there's rationale, and these points are already kind of written out and justified by another document that the CRI puts out. And so that's useful because the organization might have to, say, also attest to different regulations, say DORA or regulations that are applicable in Canada, Australia, Japan, just to name a few.
Right, I see. So, those of our listeners who've tuned into these webinars before will have heard us talk about sort of how different regulations sort of where they match and where they don't. So this is a good tool for that. Let me get Richard your point of view. I'm hearing a lot of organizations talk about sort of they're aligned to a framework but not like fully compliant. What's that all about, and how's that going for them?
Great question. Thanks, Janne. Alignment is something that's just kind of thrown around now like a buzzword at this point. So it can land on a slide and say, we're aligned with CRI, we're aligned with DFS, Part 500. But the reality is that proof is necessary at this point, right? Here's kind of how I think about it, right? And that comes from my expert witness work, time on the witness stand. A policy is your testimony. The log, the ticket, the timestamped approval, that's your exhibit. Testimony with no exhibits behind it kind of gets torn apart when an attorney cross-examines that. So the same thing is true on an exam with an auditor or an examiner. They don't want to hear that a control exists. They want to see the control run. They want to see on what systems. They want to see on the date, and they want to see it signed by an individual. The difference is intent versus proof, ultimately.
Yeah, okay. So, you're not compliant until you are. So let's talk about that a little bit more. What do you think, Richard, has changed in the regulation sort of landscape that's now putting CISOs under more pressure to really go out and prove that compliance?
So a handful of things kind of changed around the same time, and they push all in the same direction. The SEC put a cyber disclosure on the clock with materiality calls and tight timelines. New York's DFS now wants a senior officer and the CISO to sign their names to compliance certifications. And that's a very different feeling than a status slide, for example, right?
Sure.
DORA went live across the EU at the start of 2025. And the FFIEC pulled the cybersecurity assessment tool off of its site last August. So FFIEC CAT has been sunset. People can't really coast on that old questionnaire any longer.
All right. But like, why is this conversation like particularly relevant to financial institutions right now?
Well, so it's relevant. I think that comes back to you were asking, Miguel, do you have to use CRI? And the answer is no, you don't need to use CRI as a financial institution, but it is the most efficient way to prove the things that you have to prove, right?
Okay.
It's free, it's tough to beat, it's specifically built for financial institutions, and it's got that direct crosswalk from CAT, so old work carries over very cleanly.
Anything you want to add to that, Miguel, about sort of, why this is more relevant than before, and why should CISOs care about CRI?
I think tacking on to what Richard said before, I think organizations these days honestly just have more regulatory responsibilities nowadays. And even besides being we're talking mainly about financial institutions, but we're also seeing different regulations come through with a broader scope, such as NIS2 and RED over in the EU. I think in general, there's just a lot more that organizations are expected and required to do these days.
Is it just by the word regulation, like regulation from government bodies and things like that, or is it also like are clients asking you to be sort of show certification or things like that?
I was mainly referring to governing bodies, but you do bring up a good point. I think clients definitely are much more, we'll say, aware of the risks of third parties, dealing with third parties, and I think many of them are really also just amping up their TPRM.
Yeah. So do you think, Richard, that this will help sort of having the full sort of CRI compliance scope, having those answers on hand, like will that help you in those conversations with clients as well?
Absolutely. It shows proof that you've done the work to secure your environment, shows proof that you understand what's required of you as an organization. And so it's the next step in showing your clients that you've not just fulfilled the requirements set forth for your organization, but that you're actively taking a stance on security and ensuring their security alongside your organization's.
Yeah. All right. So before we dig any deeper into CRI specifically, let me understand, Richard, what were the challenges organizations were facing with the previous assessment approaches? Like, why did we need this new thing?
Sure. So that's a great question. And I mentioned before that organizations were coasting on CAT. The easiest way to put it is that CAT gave you a grade, like an A, B, C, D, F. CRI gives you a whole file, like a case file, again, to kind of continue with the legal framework. CAT scored you on a maturity scale, and it was fairly rigid. CRI is built around these control objectives and the evidence sitting behind each one of them. It maps out straight to the regulations that matter to these entities. For example, the Fed, OCC, FDIC, CFTC, and on your side of the water, ECB and NISA, excuse me.
Yeah.
So the CAT could tell you that you were a 3, right? But CRI tells you which actual obligations you're meeting and hands you the structure to prove every single one of them. Two more things separate them, and that's that CRI scales by impact tier, kind of alluding to what Miguel mentioned earlier, with the impacts of the tier of the organization, but also the impact of something occurring. So it flexes to your size instead of treating a credit union like a money center bank.
I'm a sucker for a spreadsheet, and this one really just compacts so much information and makes it so legible and really just easy to not only do the work and fill out and give your organization like a good view of what you have in place in terms of cybersecurity controls. But also for someone who's an auditor who's like totally new to it, not in the weeds like we or your cybersecurity team is, it's just really good at presenting information and mapping it to whatever is relevant at the time.
Okay, so let's dig in a little bit deeper, Miguel. Information framework. How would you describe that in practical terms? Like, what is it at home?
Sure. I mean, at its most basic level, it's a workbook that gives you a list of all of these different diagnostic statements, broken down by category, a list of what kinds of evidence might be applicable to each of these, and separately, a mapping of each of these controls with the reference numbers to, I'd say, about a dozen, 2 dozen different regulations. And within each of those, again, line by line, if that control statement in the CRI applies completely, partially, or not at all to one of these regulations. So you can do the work once and say there's something is partially met in the NYDFS. You kind of know to ask a follow-up question then. Or if it's not covered, you know that that's one extra bit of work that you have to do. But then again, all of that work is already done in a central place. So it's much easier and much more of an organized approach to gathering this information.
Richard, anything you want? Richard,
I think
can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. There was a little bit of a lag.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I think Miguel got it, hit the nail on the head. I would just add that in our experience, people see 300 or hear 300 controls, 300 plus controls, and they flinch. The right move really is to understand what your tier is as an organization before you concern yourself with the number of controls or control statements that CRI puts forth for your organization. It could be half that, depending on your size.
Okay. Yeah. No. Okay. So, Richard, you mentioned the FFIIC CAT. What makes the CRI different from, for example, that or some of the more traditional assessment models?
Well, like I said before, CAT gave you a grade and CRI gives you a lot more of a file with which you can use the evidence inside to prove to a regulator. So really the difference is that at the end of the day, if you use CRI, you could sit down in a room full of regulators and satisfy them with that CRI result, whereas FFIEC CAT didn't give you that breadth of information that you would need. Now that regulators are looking for evidence and not just checkboxes.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. But like, I guess what I'm wondering with all these questions is like, why is this happening now? Why do you think CRI is gaining traction like right now at this minute?
Mainly because of the regulations that have been put in place in the last 2 years. So things like 23 NYDFS 500, which is Part 500 amendment of New York DFS, the European regulations that have come into play in the last few years regarding privacy, such as DORA. I think that, and security, I think that those are the things that are effectively driving organizations to need a better platform to prove and show evidence of their compliance. And so CRI for the financial industry is really the answer to the question posed by new regulations.
Okay. Anything you want to add to that, Miguel?
I think Richard's got that one.
No. Okay. So let me ask you this then. Does CRI fundamentally change something in the relationship organizations have with regulators and auditors? I understand that it's going to make it easier for you to interact with them, but like, is that it? Like, what are the real changes here?
I think the major change here is that it's going to be much easier to provide a consistent story to different regulators. With the way I've mentioned before of the CRI kind of being the bulk of the work and then easily adapted to different regulations and different frameworks, it really helps your organization kind of get your story straight and likewise provide that one sort of truth to different regulators.
Let me go to you, Richard. Do you agree with that? Is the value of CRI the consistency or sort of the evidence in it, or something else entirely?
Yeah, I would agree that the evidence, the consistency, the ability to shrink the friction that occurs when doing collection of said evidence. So it really attempts to make a smoother experience for everyone involved throughout the process. It removes the ambiguity as to what's expected for each control. Effectively, taking the friction out.
All right. Well, let's get into that friction a little bit. I mean, I want to hear about the sort of real world experiences you guys have had. Richard, what do you think separates organizations that handle stuff like the CRI really well from those that you find struggling?
Sure, that's a good question. And actually, I'm going to address that and some of the biggest mistakes that I see kind of as two
Sure.
pieces there, if you don't mind. So I see three main mistakes everywhere, and that is stale evidence where someone grabs a screenshot from 8 months ago, or in some cases 3-4 years ago, and swears that it's current. That's obviously not going to hold up when an examiner looks at it. The next is screenshot theater, where an artifact kind of proves that a policy exists on paper but never shows the control running. And the last is orphan controls, where you ask who owns this and no one knows.
Right.
And with organizations that are really of any mature level beyond startup, you see some semblance of at least one of those. To answer what separates organizations that succeed from those that struggle, obviously not falling into any of those traps in evidence collection is one of them. But the other two variables that I see, and it might surprise some that tooling is not one of these, but it comes down to executive ownership and evidence discipline, right? So organizations that struggle are treating CRI as the security team's homework, and control ownership lives nowhere in particular. Evidence gets thrown together in a panic the week before, or in some cases, honestly, while we're doing the assessment with them. Orgs that do it really well make control ownership a real business responsibility with named owners in the infrastructure, identity and vendor management, and not just having them inside security. They pull evidence as a routine all year instead of doing it when requested as a scramble. And honestly, to be blunt, people keep hoping otherwise, but a GRC platform helps at the edges. It's not going to save a program with no owners. So you can buy the nicest tool on the market and still fail the exam because nobody can produce a receipt.
Yeah. What about you, Miguel? Anything sort of any mistakes you've spotted, or anything that sets apart the ones that succeed from the ones that struggle for you?
The one that surprised me the most is actually one that Richard brought up. He had a clever name for it, control theater, where everyone swears that there's a policy documented somewhere or it's referenced in many other documents, but we never see it. So it's good as not having it, in my opinion.
Right. What about you, Richard? What surprised you the most when you started doing CRI assessments?
The sheer number of times that we prepare an organization for the artifacts that we'll be asking for, and then we start the assessment, and half of them are nowhere to be found.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think organizations have a pretty good grasp about the sort of effort involved in one of these exercises, or do you think it's under or overestimated?
I think that has a lot to do with experience ultimately, right? CRI is relatively new. Organizations that are doing it probably did CAT before, and it's a new experience entirely. As I mentioned before, there's some old cross mapping so that some of your previous work can be used, but I think that anytime you go into a new exercise like this, you have to budget for it to balloon out of control in ways that you won't expect. Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. What about Miguel? What do you think about? Do organizations have a good grasp about the level of effort this needs?
I think it's more of thinking about the maturity of an organization's cybersecurity program. If an organization is used to producing evidence and has everything kind of organized, I'm thinking like, I think the single most useful document to have is a register of your cybersecurity like policy documents. That way, at first glance, you kind of know what is and isn't there. But it's not even so much having the controls in place as much as it is having an organized filing cabinet, so to speak.
Yeah, I guess I've never been involved in a sort of an exercise like this, like going through any kind of compliance framework. So I'm just wondering, like, what does that look like? Handling hundreds and hundreds of controls every day. Like, what does that look like day to day?
I think I'll go ahead and take this. I think what's surprising is that once you take a look at the controls within the CRI, hundreds sounds pretty daunting, but most of these controls have quite significant overlap and are kind of meant to support each other. So we'll start with, like, for example, I don't know, like you have to inspect browser traffic, right? So on top of that control, we have, okay, do you have rules for that? Which team is empowered to do that? Is there a policy that tells end users that their browser traffic is being inspected? It's kind of, each control isn't its own sort of disparate world. Everything kind of builds on top of each other to make sure that these controls are fully supported by each other and thoroughly implemented within our organization.
Okay. Richard,
And to add to that, yeah, there are definitely larger breakdowns within the profile. For example, protect is one of them. So you have a certain number of controls that fall under protect, detect, identify. So govern is another. So just thinking about the last time that we did a large assessment for a multinational bank, we had 5 consultants on it with a lot of communication internally because 318 controls, and you break it down by those sections. So one person might take detect, another one take protect, and there's more overlap within those naturally. So you know what you're looking for. You have a little better idea of where the organization may be lacking. It really is thoughtfully put together in that sense to make it easier to chunk.
Okay. So do you think, Richard, that this is something or teams can sort of manage easily, or do you see teams getting like overwhelmed by everything that's involved in the assessment?
It can be very easily overwhelming if you only look at it from the high level, big picture point of view. But if you have the resources and someone who's at the helm, who's experienced doing this, then it's very easy to break it down into more manageable, bite-sized pieces where it still does take time and effort, but it's entirely doable. For a large organization, you want to budget around 2 months to do this assessment.
Okay. What about you, Miguel? Do you like what teams and skill sets do you find are more important than other, sort of even critical during the process?
I'm trying to think of our last assessment, and I think partially because this was the part that I was most heavily involved with, but I think governance and like the sort of the GRC part of an IT organization, because for the most part, it's that kind of these controls are very documentation heavy, and at least at the start, they really kind of build out the framework of where to continue to gather evidence. So I think having your GRC team be very organized and well developed, I think, is the start of what makes a good assessment. Not to say this isn't make or breaking a whole cybersecurity program, but in terms of the assessment, like I said, having that organized filing cabinet so you can just pull out policies and know where to look next.
What about you, Richard? Any sort of skills or most valued teams that stand out to you?
It's important to remember and to mention again that this only succeeds with buy-in from leadership. So if you have leadership saying, yeah, just do this, but they're not actively invested in it, that's the kind of result you're going to get. You really need somebody who cares from the top down and who understands, quite frankly, that their name is going to be on the form that's signed, so that they should care. That's the whole point of the regulation. If you don't have that, then that base foundation isn't going to be there, and it's going to be much harder for everybody else who's functioning as part of this assessment to do it at their best because they don't have that foundation from leadership.
No, yeah, I see. I do want to dig into leadership in a moment, but let me just still sort of on your real world experiences, Richard. When you waded into CRI, were there any sort of lessons you learned early on that sort of changed how you approach the assessment?
Well, that's a good question. I guess the first thing that we encountered was that organizations frequently will put evidence that you're looking for in places that you may not expect, that looking for a larger sweep of evidence because things may not be always named the way that one might expect them to be, or that older collateral kind of gets lost. It's still provided to you, but people don't think about it or update it frequently unless, again, that's baked into the culture of the organization. So from my perspective, when we first started with CRI, we would ask for the evidence we felt was necessary. Now I think we ask for a wider swath of it, expecting that some of the things will not be documented appropriately or the way that they would most easily be found. And that's not to blame anybody. It's just the nature of a large organization. Sometimes things slip through the cracks.
Sure.
Yeah, and I want to add to that too. Well, that was frustrating. CRI does also provide some help in that respect. On top of each control having recommended evidence, there's also a broader, I think they call it a diagnostic statement tag. So things like IAM or application security, like broader categories that aren't necessarily, govern, identify, protect. But if you find evidence for something in one domain in one document, you can kind of cross-reference by this subject tag to hopefully find, I guess, the edge cases where it's covered by this subject tag and broadly referenced in the document, but again, not in the document you might expect for this particular control.
Okay. All right. I do want to remind our audience that we're going to have some time for questions at the end. So I can see some of the questions are coming in already, but keep them coming. We will have some time for that towards the end. But now I want to move us to sort of, Richard, you already mentioned the leadership a little bit and sort of the CISO perspective for all of this. So do you think that CRI helps security leaders have sort of stronger conversations with boards and executives? Does this bring them that common language?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So this is where CRI's maturity model came in version 2.1 and really earns its place because it gives you peer benchmarking, and that's the one language that a board is going to understand, right? It's where we sit compared to other institutions. Lands in just a couple of seconds with a board member. A detailed control narrative, regardless of how good it is, isn't going to land the same way, right? They're not looking for us to explain to them, malware protection and incident detection documentation. They want they're looking for something a little more high level. So you pair that with the harmonization line, the one assessment answers thousands of requirements, and you've kind of reframed this whole thing, right? You walk in to a board conversation or an executive conversation with what looks like a security update, and you walk out having had a conversation about risk and position, and that's the conversation the board actually wants to have, right? Instead of translating your program into security, you're translating it into where you stand and what it would cost to be wrong. And that's what they're looking for to understand what to fund.
Speaking of funding, Miguel, if you're like a board member or a C-level person in an organization, how should you think about budgeting and resourcing for CRI?
I think the best way to sell this is the sort of reusable angle of this assessment. If your organization is going to have to do an NYDFS assessment, if your organization is going to have to say, I think there's an FFIC CAT spinoff for ransomware readiness. All of that is already mapped within the CRI. So it's really kind of, you do the bulk of the work once, you budget for this one project, and subsequent assessments become much smaller projects. So it kind of pays for itself once.
Strong argument there. So having Richard, what do you think are some of the things that CISOs should do to prepare for an assessment like this before starting?
It depends on how new the CISO is to the company, of course.
Sure.
Typically, with a newer CISO, we're going to suggest something like a current state analysis so that they completely understand what it is that they're walking into, right? With somebody who's more experienced, you might be looking for, you might be basically preparing in a different way, ultimately. So let's talk about a CISO who's more experienced rather than thinking about the one who needs to come in and get the map of the territory.
Sure.
The three things that they should be preparing are time, ownership, and the signature question, right? You budget more for evidence work and the program management than for the assessment itself, because that's where the hours actually end up going. And first timers typically get that ratio wrong, is what we've seen. Before you begin, line up your control owners, not halfway through. Decide early who's comfortable putting their name to this is true and current, because when thinking about New York certification rules and general attestation, somebody has to sign. And that's a conversation you want to have at the start, calmly, not during the week of the deadline in a hurry where you discover the person you thought might sign hasn't read the fine print or did and has gone quiet. There's a lot of other things to keep in mind. Of course, the framework is free, but the program is not. And so that's something the CISO needs to clear with the CFO up front. Again, most of the cost is people time, potentially a GRC platform if you decide to run through one. So you have to budget for a program owner, for their time spread across the business, and for tooling or an outside partner such as ourselves to get you through that first cycle cleanly.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Miguel?
I think Rich has got most of that, actually.
Okay. So let me ask you something else then. Is this just another compliance thing, or are we actually seeing organizations sort of mature operationally through this process?
I think we definitely are seeing organizations mature operationally, and I think it's because at the start, because I mentioned how all of these controls sort of overlap, I think it really does help highlight what's missing in an organization and kind of put the onus on the cybersecurity program to then, and later to management, to fund these things that help implement the controls and help them keep them documented and help, the difficulties that are present within working through one of these assessments are difficulties that are going to be present at your next audit. So it's best to take care of them at this assessment that is already so, in my opinion, well organized.
Anything you want to add, Richard?
Sure, yeah. When done honestly, I would say that the mechanism is the evidence discipline itself, right? The moment that you require current proof and a named owner for every control, you back into real operational habits, whether you set out to or not, right? You can't fake your way to a clean evidence trail. So you actually have to run the controls. The risk is doing it as a paper exercise in which you get like a very tiny binder and zero maturity. And Miguel and I have seen both of these, and you can tell them apart in 10 minutes. The maturity never comes from the score on the page. It comes from the routines the assessment forces on the organization, the reoccurring pulls, the ownership, the habit of being able to show your work. You chase those routines and the score shows up on its own.
Yeah, okay. I did want to ask you sort of, Miguel was already talking about sort of how you only pay for this once and then you get to reuse it like forever. But what would you, Richard, say to a CISO who feels that CRI sounds a little resource intensive?
I would say to them that you're already doing the bulk of the work. It's just kind of smushed across the dozen frameworks and duplicated a bunch of times, which is why it feels really heavy. So CRI is meant to consolidate all this. You're not adding a workload, you're collapsing a bunch of workloads. And then you weigh it against the alternative, right? Which is the part that people skip. Getting caught flat in an exam with no evidence trail, or worse, in an actual incident in front of a regulator with nothing to show. That's the most expensive outcome. And it totally dwarfs the cost of any program, right?
No, for sure. Okay. All right, so let's talk about sort of best practices and I guess hard-earned lessons here. If a company is preparing to begin CRI, let's say next quarter, what are the 3 most important things they should do first? Do you want to go first, Richard?
Sure. Very first thing you'd want to do is spend at least 2 weeks on evidence inventory and ownership before even looking at the diagnostic statements. Temptation is to feel like you can produce scoring on day one, but you end up slowing everything down by trying to do that. I would say that that's absolutely the first thing to keep in mind, right? And that's more, most of the pain in a first assessment is self-inflicted and front-loaded. So if you kind of get that understanding ahead of time, you can really reduce the amount of pain that you're experiencing through that.
Okay. Miguel, anything you want to add? What are your sort of important preparations?
I think if an organization doesn't have a register of policies, standards, procedures, that would be the first thing to do to make sure everything is, at least at first glance, there's some kind of method to the madness, some kind of organization in place. And secondly, I would say we've talked a lot about getting buy-in from CISO and management and the board for doing this. I think from CISO down also, we need to have all of the different teams within, not just IT security, but the IT organization, and we'll think procurement as well, and HR and other regulations. Other departments that touch on cybersecurity that are mentioned within the CRI. This isn't just we can get the CISO's buy-in and we only cooperate with the cybersecurity team. This kind of just touch on all parts of an organization.
Okay. Any sort of big mistakes, you guys? I mean, I feel you're touching on this a little bit, but anything you want to sort of really drive home here?
Yeah, I have one more actually. So when it comes to impact tiering, right? If this is your first time, have the impact tiering reviewed by someone who's actually run one of these before, because that single decision will scope everything downstream, and it is genuinely miserable to unwind that once you're committed and you're weeks in.
Okay. So let me ask you this then. How can teams avoid getting that sort of control fatigue during assessments?
So I mentioned this before, kind of, and it's that you want to chunk things, right? And that's what CRI helps you to do. Sequence the work. Don't just open up the profile and look at all 318 objectives and try to bench press them all in one shot, right? Group them by owner, by evidence source, so that you're not hitting a single team with the same request from 5 different directions in the same week. And that alone will kill most of the resentment that you can create doing this. The other way is lean on the examples of effective evidence, the EEE packages that are directly in the CRI spreadsheet, because that's what they exist for, right? A lot of teams never look at them, and you can set a steady cadence so the whole thing feels like a rhythm instead of a forced march, right? Fatigue typically comes from work that feels both infinite and invisible. So if you make it finite and you make it visible, your people will stay with you and they'll have a light at the end of the tunnel.
Anything you want to add, Miguel?
Yeah, on top of those evidence packages that Richard brought up, I want to bring the subject tags up again. Once it's chunked and you're done with one category, I'll throw out protected as an example. You can see which of these tags apply to other parts, to other controls, and use the same evidence wherever it overlaps. So again, it's really kind of just drawing connections between work you've already done. Within we've talked about deduplicating work across the organization for different assessments, and now we're talking about deduplicating work within the CRI. But it does provide you the tools to do that.
Okay. Do you think, Miguel, there's a risk of organizations sort of over-engineering or overthinking their approach?
Definitely. And I think this, even before we get to the CRI, this applies to organizations that fall into this sort of analysis paralysis of when can you implement a control that's required if you don't have the documentation, and you end up in a chicken and egg sort of situation. I think when it comes to the CRI, and I'll think of an example of non-compliance, what's important so much isn't that, I think what's most important here is that everything is documented. If there's a rationale behind why something wasn't implemented or how something will be implemented, instead of, again, this analysis paralysis that some organizations can get stuck in prior to attestation.
Richard, anything you want to say about sort of overthinking the assessment?
Yeah, the profile is built to scale down, right? So you should let it. The whole point of the impact tiering is to tell the organization how much is enough and then stop. So you match your effort to your actual tier and don't try and gold plate anything, because that's not going to impress an examiner. It's just going to burn the team out and do work or force work that nobody asked for and that doesn't buy you anything. So just stick to your tier. And the other thing that we see with some frequency is that sometimes teams will try to build elaborate tooling and like a really elaborate workbook with conditional formatting before they even start poking at the objectives. That is not going to help them, and the CRI workbook is designed to be used directly. You don't need to build out a whole nother one, with the exception of some edge cases, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say you've got the ball rolling. You're doing the whole CRI assessment. Things are going well. How do you keep that momentum going during like a lengthy compliance program? Not even just the assessment, just the whole thing. Like how do you keep that momentum going?
Named owners, visible scoreboards, short sessions that reoccur regularly rather than marathon sessions, and helping to get some early wins on the board to incentivize people quickly, right? Knock out objectives that you can evidence immediately so leadership sees actual movement in the first couple of weeks rather than just a status update that says still planning. And you have to keep the work feeling finite, right? Momentum dies the second people feel like the work is endless and people can't see progress. So we as consultants or you as an organization need to give clear finish lines, scoreboards that people can actually look at. It's soft management advice, obviously, but it's not like you're doing this all year round. It's specifically for this assessment, for this program, and it really does make the difference between people crossing the finish line or stalling out on week 4 or week 6, right?
Yeah.
I want to add that as an added benefit to chunking the work, right? It helps keep the context and the documents that we're looking at different and fresh, so it doesn't look like we're doing the same work over and over again.
Right. Okay. So one more thing on this, on your sort of hard-earned lessons here. What would you do differently next time, Miguel?
I think, truthfully, I would have taken advantage of these subject tags more. There were some times where I had difficulty finding the right document to evidence a control when it was already in the workbook, just referenced under a different similar control. I just hadn't, bothered to look at these tags, and they really do save a lot of work.
What about you, Richard?
Well, like I mentioned, a lot of it is getting that documentation in place early on and making sure that it's going to be provided to you and reviewed before you even start poking at the controls. I would say that that's really the thing that makes the biggest difference in my experience. So it's something I said already, but ultimately that is what I think sets the stage and the foundation for a really easier assessment. Or if you're talking about it from the perspective of the org owner or the evidence owner in the org, inventory your evidence before you start to self-score on the tiering, or basically just try to inventory your evidence and keep that live and good at all times throughout the year, because it's going to make your and everybody else's lives easier.
Okay. So let's talk about the sort of the frameworks and transitions there. How do you think, Richard, teams should think about sort of future framework updates and evolving versions?
Good question. I think that based on what we've seen, right, the evolution of CRI hasn't been major overhauls since version 2. So you build your program on the objectives and not the version sticker, right? Its core diagnostic statements specifically didn't change across 2.0, 2.1, or 2.2. The changes came in through mappings catalog instead. So when like DORA showed up in version 2.1 or AI resources arrived in version 2.2 this spring, you can pick them up without having to rework a single control.
So are you saying companies should focus maybe less on sort of versions and more on I don't know, the core principles here?
Exactly, because those are not going to change. CRI has shown that they understand that those types of rapid, frequent changes are not going to win them any users, and they're not going to, make them a commonly used core framework. So again, they're changing these things slowly, deliberately, and without having to, without their change from 2.1 to 2.2 forcing you to rework any of the controls you've already got evidence for or mappings for.
What about you, Miguel? Do you think it's sort of worth organizations trying to future-proof their work, or should they worry less about that?
Oh, I'm sorry, and I think you.
Here, do you want? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I was asking is do you think it's worth organizations trying to sort of future-proof their work, or should they sort of just maybe worry less about that and then just get it done?
I think the second option, worry less and get it done. I think the changes that we've seen so far have been pretty small and incremental. And I think there was a good point that Richard brought up earlier during this webinar, which is that the maturity really comes through during the exercise of this. So it's not so important exactly if we're talking about the process of gathering evidence and attestation, it doesn't really matter what version we're talking about here. It's that practice and that exercise that kind of shows up as proof that an organization is mature and ready for this. So I think in both respects, I think it's more important to focus on the core principles here.
Okay. I do want to stay on the sort of transition a little bit longer. Richard, you mentioned the FFIEC CAT. Say used to that, and now that it's sunset, what does transitioning to CRI like really look like?
Sure. I actually, if you don't mind, wanted to just mention quickly something
Go ahead, sir.
about the last question. So
Sure.
when it comes to versioning, I just wanted to add that nobody's ever failed an exam because they were on the wrong point release, right? Organizations fail because half their controls have no owner or their proof is stale. But the versioning conversation is really easy to have because it's concrete and people can argue that very cleanly. There's a right answer. Teams gravitate to that to avoid the messy stuff. But the messy stuff is actually the important stuff that you're in danger of not focusing heavily enough on. And that's ownership and evidence. And that's really what decides on whether or not you pass.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about transitioning from the CAT? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So for organizations that were or maybe still are using CAT, although again, it's been sunset now for a little while, the transition is actually really a lot less painful than people fear, and that's by design. So CRI was built with a direct CAT crosswalk, which is a big part of why FFIEC pointed at it in the first place. In practice, you map your existing CAT answers and the evidence behind them straight across, run the impact tiering, and then work the deltas that fall out.
Okay.
Again, the CAT's been gone since last August, which means you can't lean on it as your primary tool anymore. Full stop. But that work that you did isn't wasted, right? It's the message that we try and provide to organizations who are dreading this. You're not migrating. You are migrating. Excuse me. You're migrating. You're not starting from a blank page.
Sure.
So the years that you spent on CAT brought you a head start on CRI. Most institutions are a lot closer than they assume on day one. They just haven't done the mapping to see it yet, and that's the fear.
Yeah. So I do want to get to the audience questions soon, but let me leave us with this one final thought. If the organizations listening to this webinar are if they are to remember one thing from today, what would that be? First.
Sure. I think I want to emphasize that the proof isn't necessarily, or the proof of an organization's maturity isn't going to be in, or necessarily in this attestation, right? Where you're going to see this, where you're going to see the fruits of this labor, isn't in a compliance checkmark, but it's in the attestation itself, in collecting the evidence, how smooth that process goes. So in doing a CRI profile assessment, if things go well, you're already in a good place to remediate any missing controls. And that's a better place to be in, I think, than having a very clunky attestation where you fulfill most controls, but then it's like the work to fill in those remaining gaps might be much greater.
Richard, what's your key takeaway?
Great point, Miguel. I would say that frameworks, the key takeaway from me is frameworks tell you what to do, and proof shows that you did it. And the gap is what we're talking about. So institutions that come through in the next few years in good shape are going to be ones that can put the evidence on the table on demand on any given day with no warning, no fire drill, whether the person asking is an examiner, a board member, or opposing legal counsel. If your org can do that, then you can just look at the framework essentially as a filing cabinet, right? It's useful, but it's not the point. The point is the evidence. Everything else is just the paperwork waiting for someone to ask hard questions. So you build the kind of program that's ready for that question, and you stop dreading the examiners.
All right. I do want to go to the audience questions right now. And yep, seems like somebody read my mind. If you could give one message to security leaders listening today, what would be, I think, pretty much what we just covered? Or do you have anything to add, guys? No? Fair enough. Let's move on. What's one misconception people have about CRI? That's a good question.
I think that's something you covered at the very top of our discussion. People see CRI framework and think, okay, who is telling me I have to do this? Do I have to do this? Is this a requirement? What's the governing body that's telling me I have to do this? It's not. It's not a law. It's not a regulation. It's a very helpful tool, and I'd recommend you use it.
Richard, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would say I see two primary misconceptions about CRI. The first one is that it's just kind of NIST CSF for banks or one more checklist to grind through, and that's definitely not true. That framing kind of does it like a big disservice, honestly. It's an engine or a method for harmonizing, right? The questions CRI is asking are not the point. The point is that answering them once maps you out to thousands of requirements across multiple jurisdictions, and that leverages the entire value proposition. The second misconception that we see, or I see a lot, and this one is particularly tough for executives, is that it's some kind of certification. There's no CRI badge to hang in the lobby. Nobody comes and stamps you and says, good job. It's a self-assessment or a third-party assessment, which we've done for plenty of orgs, but it's built to make supervisory conversations go smoother. And that's quite frankly meant to make things like a little quieter and more useful than a certificate, right? People typically want a gold star. CRI is not handing that out. It gives you the ability to answer hard questions.
Yeah. We do have two questions that are sort of coming at sort of the very same point. One is, where do you see regulatory expectations heading over the next few years? And the other sort of feeds, I guess, do you think regulators are becoming more interested in evidence than intent?
So I'll take the second one to start, if that's all right. And I've said this already on the webinar, which is why I'm grabbing it, but more evidence, that's what regulators want to see and what they expect. More evidence, more personal accountability, more continuous assessment instead of point-in-time snapshots. And, it would not be 2026 with a webinar without mentioning AI. AI risks is folding the existing programs rather than sitting off in its own quarter as a science project, right? So financial services AI risk management framework and the AI resources in CRI 2.2 are kind of an early signal of where that's going. The other trend in regard to this is that cross-border convergence. DORA, NIST 2, New York DFS rules, all of them are circling the same demand from different directions. And that is, show me you can operate your controls and recover when something breaks. So I would bet on attestation requirements continuing to spread because regulators have learned that a signature changes behavior in a way that a questionnaire never did. We're seeing that trend is consistent and not at all subtle, and everything is moving towards demonstratable, owned, signed, and continuous.
Miguel, really briefly, what do you want to add? Where do you see regulatory expectations heading?
It's a 100% agree there with Richard. I think the emphasis on personal accountability and having a CISO sign off really changes the tone of what an attestation, means.
Okay, that makes sense. With that, I want to thank our audience today and especially our experts, Richard Suls and Miguel Gutierrez. Thank you for being with us today and taking us through this issue. This has been a Reversec webinar. I hope to see you next time.